now we've got to the point where the story says, well, human beings became self-conscious, and here's the problem with that. The problem is that we're terribly self-conscious about our inadequacies and our vulnerabilities, and that sets up enmity between men and women, and it dooms women to pain in childbirth and child-rearing, and it dooms men to work. It's a big problem. Okay, so now the next story that comes up in the sequence is the story of Cain and Abel. Now, you know, we talked about the dragon of chaos, and then the terrible mother and the creative mother, and the tyrannical father and the secure father, and then the adversary and the hero. Cain and Abel are the first manifestation of the adversary and the hero. And what happens is they emerge as soon as the original Genesis story ends. So what the story basically proposes is that once people became self-conscious, two modes of being emerged as a consequence of that. And one mode is represented by Cain, and the other mode is represented by Abel. And that's echoed in the story of the hostile brothers, in stories of hostile brothers everywhere, but it's also paralleled in Christianity by the idea of the relationship between Christ and Satan. So it's like Cain and Abel are precursors to the idea of Christ and Satan. Now what happens is that, so Cain is the older brother, and that makes him sort of the embodiment of tradition. He would also be the favored one in terms of the traditions of the ancient Israelites, because he would be the one that inherits everything. So he's actually the one he's like the embodiment of tradition, and there's some advantages to that because he's privileged because of it, but there's some disadvantages because to the degree that culture itself has become sterile and inappropriate, and he manifests that means that he manifests error by merely being what he was. Now what happens with, and then Abel is the young brother. So Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. Okay, so there's a dichotomy of professions here, and people have read that in all sorts of different ways. But one of the ways that you can think about it is that there are valid different modes of being in the world. You know, so you can be, in this situation, you can be a tiller of the ground or a keeper of animals, but in the world in general, you can adopt any number of roles that suffice. You can be a plumber, you can be a lawyer, and there's ways of acting within those roles that transcend the roles themselves. And so that's part of what's being exemplified in Cain and Abel. So they can function in the world despite their different roles. In process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. And Abel, he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof. Now that's very archaic, the idea of sacrifice. Okay, so basically what happens is that you're trying to get God on your side, and so God seems to want something from you because he keeps demanding this and that. So you might say, well, reality wants something from you. It wants you to behave in a certain way so that you don't suffer any more than you have to, and so that things go well for you. Now human beings at this point in time are trying to work out exactly what that means. And they've already got to the point where they're conceptually sophisticated enough to understand that that means that sacrifices are necessary. Now you remember that it's only prior to this that human beings discover time itself, right? That's when they discover that they become self-conscious and discover their extension across time. And so one of the consequences of realizing that you're extended across time is that you also will come to the realization that you may have to let go of certain valuable things right now in order to make things work better in the future. And you can't imagine that people just woke up and figured that out. Like it took people, God only knows how long to sort that out. It's tens of thousands of years to come up with that realization. First of all, they would have acted it out, like bees do. You know, they collect honey and they make it through the winter, but they don't know what the hell they're doing. Or maybe they do, maybe they're little supercomputers like these bloody atoms. But you know what I mean, you can act this sort of thing out without realizing what you're up to. And the motif of sacrifice seemed to be exactly that. People stumbled onto the dramatic idea that if you gave up something of value, there would be some reasonable possibility that God would smile on you in the future. Okay, so that's why there's the sacrifices. Now you might say, well, why did they burn them? And the reason for that is, well, as far as I can tell, people are trying to understand what the ultimate fabric of existence is. And I think that you can feel that sometimes. And one of the places that people feel that regularly is when they're out at night and they look up at the sky. And they see this immense blanket of eternity that's laid out before them. And that induces a feeling of awe. And I think that archaic people took the notion of that awe that was a consequence of this apprehension and associated that with something like communion with the divine, which is actually quite reasonable, because when you are looking out into space, you are looking into the farthest reaches of being. You can see back millions, hundreds of millions of years back into time, and you gaze out into the infinite expanses of being. So it's not unreasonable to assume that in some sense at that moment you have some connection with what's infinite, whatever that happens to be. And I think that you feel that rather than think it. So anyways, the idea basically emerged that the divine was up in the sky, and that because the divine was up in the sky, you could maybe communicate with it by sending messages up there. And one of the ways you could do that was with smoke. And so if you're burning these things that you're offering, you get to push the smoke up to God, and he can do a molecular analysis and see if what you're offering is of any reasonable quality, and if it seems to be, then poof, God's going to be thrilled about that, or maybe he's not. Now what happens is that Cain's offerings are rejected, and Abel's offerings are accepted. And so what that means is that Cain gets the short end of the stick, and Abel gets everything good happening to him. So what you see happening is that there's the notion of two paths of being, one that's favored and one that isn't favored. Now the story is very ambivalent about why Cain is not favored and Abel is. And you can read it multiple ways. You can just say, well, God's basically being a son of a bitch, and he's not going to give Cain anything just because he's not in a very good mood that day. Or you can say, well, Abel's doing something right and Cain isn't. And I think that interpreting the story in either of those ways is perfectly illuminating, because part of the time in life it seems like someone's doing everything right, and still they're just getting laid waste left, right, and center, and someone else is doing something terribly and things are going well for them. But then you also see the reverse, where someone who's doing well gets rewarded and someone who isn't, doesn't. So there's an ambivalence about it. Now I think the story does indicate that Cain is doing something wrong, but it doesn't do that until later. So anyways, so the idea basically is that Abel makes these sacrifices. He's putting forth the best that he has. He's doing his best, and because of that, it's actually working. Everyone likes Abel. He's getting along with his wives. His flocks are increasing. He's a good guy. It's like everything's going well. Whereas Cain, things aren't going very well at all, and no one really cares for him. And besides that, he's burning with jealousy because, despite the fact that he's slaving away, raising all these vegetables and trying to offer them to God, nothing is going his way. So not only are things going badly for him, but he's increasingly disaffected by it. And it's not difficult to understand that. You know perfectly well that what happens to you if you're working away, you think diligently and properly, and nothing is going your way, and some other son of a bitch is just flourishing like mad beside you, that's going to make you vengeful and irritated and anxious and angry and homicidal for that matter. And it doesn't take very long before people reach that stage, at least not in their fantasies.